Everybody, Lisa Romano here, the Breakthrough Life Coach, and today I want to talk about early childhood trauma and why it's so important that we understand that what happened to us and what happens to children before the age of 1 matters. It's so important that we understand that who we become as adults is tied to what we've experienced and when we have experienced a trauma. And so I'm going to be reading from an article written by The Sun. And it was an interview they did by Dr. Perry. Well, actually, Dr. Bruce Perry was interviewed. And Dr. Perry is a child psychiatrist. He has a PhD, and he is a specialist in the field of childhood trauma. And I'll be reading from this article because I think it's so profound, and I'm not sure anybody else that I've ever read ever put this information quite the way Dr. Perry does. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is what is trauma? Can we define trauma? And Dr. Perry answers it this way. He says, despite using that word all the time, the psychiatric field still debates how to define it. Is trauma an external event? Is it the way we experience that event? Is it the long-term changes in emotional and physical functioning that follow the event? I define trauma as an experience or pattern of experiences that impairs the proper functioning of the person's stress response system, making it more reactive or sensitive. So it's important that we understand that every human being is wired to have a fight or flight stress response. The fight or flight stress response is not bad. In fact, it's good. It keeps us safe. We are tapped into and tuned up with the environment, and when there's a loud noise or when something happens in our experience that is a threat to our survival, our body has the ability to act quickly outside our conscious awareness of it. The bells and whistles go off, our heart rate increases, glucose floods our system, blood is shunted to our extremities, and we're ready to run away or ready to fight off an attacker. So Dr. Perry is saying that trauma is basically a pattern of experiences that makes the fight or flight response more sensitive, right? More sensitive or more reactive. So how many of us are super reactive, right? How many of us who have experienced trauma are hypervigilant? How many of us dissociate? Dissociating is not a proper response to stress. Fawning as a codependent is not a proper response to stress. Lying is not a proper response to stress. Pretending that we're not under stress is not a proper response to stress. Being argumentative, throwing chairs, blaming people, being, very aggressive. This is not a proper response to stress. So what Dr. Perry is saying is that it's basically an experience or a series of experiences that impedes a person's ability to look at a situation that they're having, experience a stressor, and be able to put the stressor into context without being super sensitive or reactive to what is going on in the particular situation. Dr. Perry goes on to say that if the brain's stress response apparatus is activated for prolonged periods, such as in a domestic violence situation, its equilibrium will change. Instead of being anxious and fearful only when confronted with a threat, a person can live in a persistent state of fear. For a child in particular, this has many negative ramifications. So we are built to have a quick stress response, and we're supposed to return to normal. Mommy, daddy, auntie, uncle, grandma, grandpa, teacher, counselor. Some adult in our environment is supposed to give us the message that we're okay. When you come from a dysfunctional home, that does not happen. You are ignored, you are marginalized, you are perhaps either covertly or overtly treated as if you were a problem or an obligation. So you, the being that you are, is in a constant state of stress. I love this example Dr. Perry uses. He says, let's say you're a 6-year-old boy, and up until now, your life has been okay. Mom and dad split up, and there was some conflict around the divorce, but nothing too terrible. Then all of a sudden, mom has a new boyfriend in the house. That's novel. And so it generates moderate stress. At dinner, he raises his voice at you. That's unpredictable. He soon starts barking orders at you more frequently. He yells at your mom. He hits you or he hits your mom. Your stress response system doesn't have time to return to a baseline before another source of stress arrives. You start having anticipatory anxiety about what will happen next. What if, what if, what if? Your baseline level of stress increases. Things that would not have bothered you much before now bother you a lot. A harsh tone of voice that may have been mildly upsetting is now overwhelming. If the boyfriend's behavior continues, your stress response system may start to register any angry tone of voice as threatening. You become what we call sensitized. This is the really interesting thing. The more stress we experienced, then yes, the more reactive we are. But that has a lot to do with our neural circuitry, because particular systems, particular neural wiring has been activated over and over and over and over. So instead of there being, let's say, a long way to respond to a stress where we have time to have a fearful stimuli process through the sensory cortex, and the hippocampus has time to say, is this something that I need to be afraid of or not? What happens in children who have been sensitized is that their fight or flight system doesn't have any time to put an event or a stimuli into context. It's a 0 to 100. And so Dr. Perry goes on to say that the more our stress response system is activated in uncontrollable ways, the less able we are to handle even small amounts of stress. When you are overstressed, you no longer have efficient access to higher brain functions. So by the time you're in a state of alarm, significant parts of your cortex, the highest functioning part of your brain, have shut down entirely. This is adaptive. If you're confronted by a predator because you don't want to waste time thinking about how to respond, you want to fight or run away. But to do your best reasoning, you need access to that sophisticated part of your brain to learn and plan. You need to be in a relatively calm state. Now, if you're a child who's experienced trauma over and over and over and over, you're not in a calm state. You haven't had the benefit of mature adults to come to your rescue and tell you that everything's going to be okay. And sometimes it's not even you're going to be okay. It's just that, wow, the house has returned to normal and people are acting normal and things are pretty predictable. And so now with this lack of unpredictability, children can return to a normal baseline. I remember growing up, I was so young. One of my earliest memories was thinking and remembering that my house was going to blow up on the third day. Meaning that if my mom was calm or my dad was calm for 2 days in a row, inevitably on the third day, the house was going to explode. So in terms of anticipatory anxiety, I was always in a state of anxiety. When is the next bomb going to go off? When is the shoe going to drop? When is my mom or my dad, when is the house going to explode? When is it going to erupt? I live that way. I understand why throughout my life I was so reactive, because I lived in a constant state of reactivity. My brain was wired for reactivity, and essentially that wasn't my fault. I'm of the belief that early childhood trauma, attachment trauma, is the root of so many of our adult issues. Those of us who have been adopted, those of us whose parents died early, those of us who were put in foster care, those of us who were born to parents who had emotional problems, schizophrenia or whatever, those of us who had parents who were self-absorbed in their own dramas and they could not attune to us for some reason, we lived in a state of survival. Dr. Perry goes on to say, he kind of says something similar. He says, first, we have to understand that feeling connected to other people is one of our most fundamental needs. We feel safer when we are with kind and familiar people. We feel accepted. Tension can arise from being part of a marginalized minority, whether you define that minority status by economics, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, identity, sexual preference, or whatever. The marginalized group has a much higher level of baseline stress. It's not a specific traumatic event, it's a continuous sense of disconnection. Our brain is constantly monitoring our environment to gauge whether or not we belong someplace. If we frequently get feedback that we don't belong, or worse, overt threats, then our body systems stay in a constant state of arousal. This increases the risk for diabetes, hypertension, and makes learning, reflection, planning, and creative problem solving harder. Over time, it will actually change the physiology of the brain, right? So those of us who talk about narcissistic abuse and growing up with narcissistic parents or growing up in a dysfunctional home where triangulation has taken place between the siblings when, maybe our parents pit us against another sibling. When we are the person or the scapegoat that feels marginalized, we feel this disconnection. And Dr. Perry strongly believes that connection is actually very, very important when it comes to being able to develop appropriate responses to stress. I'm also a firm believer that the brain is wired for addiction, meaning that our brain is designed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So Dr. Perry was asked, do traumatic experiences contribute to addiction? And this is Dr. Perry's response. To answer that, we first need to understand addiction. The brain's reward system causes us to feel pleasure when stimulated. Typically, there are many ways that we can activate those reward systems during our day, most importantly by having positive human interactions. But for a child with few loving relationships, it's hard to find those types of rewards. Maybe he's in a classroom where he's not allowed to move and there's no music or other pleasurable sensory input. He isn't in the group and sits by himself at lunch. After school, he goes home. Mom and dad are both working. So the kid turns on the TV and starts to eat even though he's not hungry. He'll eat Dorito after Dorito because the salt and the fat can stimulate the reward networks. Ultimately, he gains weight. As he gets older, he learns about online porn. He can then masturbate, and that feels good for a while. Or he learns that if he drinks, it will make him less anxious. Or he might use some drug to artificially stimulate the reward systems in the brain. The probability that you'll engage in unhealthy forms of reward increases when your stress response system is sensitized from trauma. So a child who has experienced trauma and lacks healthy relationships is primed once he's introduced to alcohol or drugs in later life to use them again and again. For somebody who has these vulnerabilities, relationship-based interventions like AA and NA are usually what works. They aren't perfect, but they're an opportunity to have human contact pretty much anytime you want. Dr. Perry is basically saying that those of us who have been traumatized and we now don't have positive human interaction, we are primed for eating disorders. We are primed for sex addiction. We are primed for love addiction, which is a relationship addiction. We stay in relationships that are painful, that are toxic, that should end. We are miserable, but we stay. We don't know how to end it. We don't know how to let go of it. Sort of like being addicted to crack. We know we shouldn't take the crack. We shouldn't do the crack, but we also know that it relieves a lot of our pressure and it leaves our pain, right? And so we fear what our body will be like and what our reality will be like without this crack ever. We're never going to experience this release of tension and anxiety again. Oh no. So we associate tremendous pleasure with staying in the addictive cycle. And it's the same with codependency. We associate so much pain with being alone that we stay in ridiculously painful experiences because we fear so much being alone with ourself. Being alone for a codependent is one of the worst things. I've heard people tell me, like, Lisa, it's scarier than death to me to end this relationship. I don't want to be alone. So this is all wonderful information. We're learning that, we're not crazy. We're learning that our reactivity has a lot to do with the way the brain was wired and stimulated as a child, and that, absolutely there is help and there is hope Even if we are codependent, even if we keep attracting difficult relationships, even if we have struggled with eating disorders and different types of addictions, there's hope for us. There's a reason we do what we do. The last point that I want to make that I think is very profound is that Dr. Perry believes that one of the most important variables is when things happen to us. If you experience emotionally disengaged caregiving, humiliation, or a sense of being unwanted in the first year or two of life, even if you then escape that environment, maybe you're adopted or your parent who was depressed gets better, that early experience can still cause profound social and emotional problems for you all the way into adulthood. On the other hand, kids who have a good first year of consistent, predictable caregiving and then end up in shelters or foster homes and bounce around the system, maybe get sexually and physically abused and so on, those children often function reasonably well as adolescents compared to the children who had issues, the first year of life, including adoption, for instance. The brain develops very rapidly in utero and for the first couple of years after birth. In utero, especially, you're making a lot of neurons, and in fact, the majority of the neurons in your brain were created in the womb. You continue to make neurons throughout your life. Today you might make 200, but there are periods in utero when you make 20,000 neurons per second. This is unbelievable. So if you think about, we're talking about trauma, and we can't talk about trauma without talking about stress response, right? And trauma shows up in us today when we experience a fearful stimuli and we have this hyperreaction. And so people that that are hypersensitive, chances are they've been traumatized, right? And so if you are that person that is hypersensitive and it has difficult time at work and you are that infected red toe like I was, it's not your fault. We can learn to put things into context. We can learn about what happened to us. We can use various forms of mindfulness. We can become more self-reflective. We can become more self-compassionate. We can learn to not react and to not fly off the handle, for instance, when we feel overly stimulated. We can make sure that we eat right. We can make sure that that our diet is balanced, doesn't have a lot of sugar, not bad fats. We use good fats. We make sure we go to bed early on time. We make sure that we drink enough water. Perhaps we go and we go to the doctor. We have a blood test done. We find out what our vitamin profile looks like. What are we missing? What are we lacking? Maybe we need more time in the sun. Maybe we need to oxygenate our tissues more. When we are in a state of survival, we don't breathe well. Our breathing is very shallow, and every cell in our body needs oxygen. So the good news is that our brain is malleable, and the more predictable we can create our lives, the more social we become with people who we believe can support us, the more we're able to reduce our reactivity to painful stimuli, which I think is just fabulous. So basically, we have the ability to reprogram our brain. We have the ability to undo what was done, and I think this speaks to the consciousness, the ability to expand our consciousness and to think about the way we think and to observe ourselves. We need more reflective time. We have to get off of frickin' Facebook. We have to stop reading about self-help so much and sit down on the couch and think about what we've read. We have to stop watching YouTube video and YouTube video and YouTube video and find time to actually think about what we just heard. We have to think about how we're feeling. We have to think about how we reacted. We have to think about how we might want to react in the future. We have to become more self-reflective. And, You cannot be self-reflective when you're constantly bombarded with various forms of stimuli, whether it's the car radio, the cell phone, social media, news stations, conversations, whatever. We have to find ways to become more quiet and more self-reflective so that we can gain control over our responses. Because there's the long way to respond to a painful stimuli, and then there's the short way. And the short way is for when there's a saber-toothed tiger in the yard and we need to react, or when we have a car accident, we need to react, or when we see someone else in danger and we need to react. That's when we need the divine ability to go from 0 to 100. What trauma survivors need to learn how to do is to learn to slow that response system down so that we're not in a hyper state of arousal and we're not reacting to what's happened in the now as if what's happening in the now is what happened in the past. So we have to learn to put our now experience into context and slow our reactivity down. We have the ability to do that, and because the brain is malleable and programmable, and especially the hippocampus, we can increase the volume of the hippocampus. We can learn, dear ones, and that's just so fabulous. So I hope this talk has inspired you to believe in the self and to believe that you can undo what was done. And I hope that you feel more inspired to become more self-reflective and to take better care of yourself, because it's not fair that you've experienced so much of what you've experienced, and because of a lack of information or awareness or whatever, or the right help, you've been in a constant state of reactivity. It's time to get you off that wheel, and it's time to get you living. Surviving is not living. Surviving is just surviving. It's not the same as thriving. So I hope this lesson has inspired you to do more than just survive these days. Namaste. Until next time. Bye for now.